I have set more bones in this county than I can count, and I have signed more death papers than I like to think on, and in 50 years of doctoring the people of Quills Ferry, I learned one thing worth passing along. A town will love a man near to death if you let it, and never once think to ask whether the loving is killing him. That is the truth of Eli Brunner, and I am the last man living who knew him before he was a legend, so the telling falls to me. I had my bag in my hand the night the Maddox came over its banks, the spring of '78, and I will not dress that night up for you. The river took the whole bottom in the dark. I was up to my chest in it before the church bell got going, and what I remember is the cold and the screaming of horses, and the way the water moved like a living thing that meant us harm. 12 families lived in that bottom. By every reckoning, we should have buried half of them. We buried none. A homesteader from the high quarter named Eli Brunner rode down into that black water with a coil of rope and a mule named Pilgrim, and he did not stop for 2 nights. He pulled the cobs off their roof. He pulled old Mother Tarrant out of her root cellar with the water at her chin. He found the henning children clinging to a cottonwood a quarter-mile downstream and brought them in one at a time across his saddlebow, and when the mule gave out, he carried the last one on his own back, wadding, with the river trying to take his legs. I set his arm when it was over. It was broken in 2 places, and he had not said a word about it. He sat on my table dripping and gray and asked me, very quiet, whether the henning girl had warmed up all right, and when I said she had, he nodded once, and that was all the conversation he wanted. You see, that is where it started, the loving and the killing both. By the next Sunday, the preacher had worked it into the sermon. By the next month, the newspaper down in Renderton had run it under a headline 3 inches tall. By the next year, there was not a child in the county who could not tell you the story of the night Eli Brunner held the river, and tell it better than it happened, with the water higher and the dark blacker and Eli 10 feet tall. They named the new footbridge after him. They wanted to name a child after him, and his mother would not allow it, said it would swell the boy's head, but they tried. And the man himself went back up to the high quarter and shut his door. I do not think the town ever meant a cruelty by it. That is the thing I want you to understand. They loved him, but there is a way of loving a man that holds him out at arm's length and never lets him come in close, the way you love a thing in a glass case at the fair. They tipped their hats to him in the street and would not sit by him at supper. The young men admired him so badly they could not speak in front of him. The girls' mothers said what a fine catch he'd make, and then steered their daughters wide of him, because how does an ordinary girl walk up to a story and ask it to pass the bread? He had done the biggest thing any of them would ever see a man do, and it had set him up on a shelf so high that for 10 years not one living soul climbed up to keep him company. He was 38 years old the autumn this story turns on. He farmed his high quarter alone, ran a few head, kept a garden a churchwoman would have envied, and came down to Quills Ferry once a fortnight for flour and nails. He'd grown quiet the way a man does when he has gone a long time with no one to talk to, not sullen, just rusty. His words come slow and careful like he was lifting them out of a deep well. He was a big, weathered, plain-faced man with hands like saddle leather, and a way of looking at the floor when folks praised him, which they did, every time, which was exactly why he stopped coming to town more than he had to. That is the loneliest man I ever doctored, and I doctored men dying alone in lined shacks. At least they knew they were alone. Eli was alone in a crowd that adored him, and that is a particular kind of cold. Now the widow. Marin Vesper came to the Maddox bottom 2 years a wife and 1 year a widow. Her husband, Tom Vesper, was a decent man and a poor farmer, and he filed a homestead claim on a fine piece of river-bottom land, and then promptly died of a fever before he ever proved it up, which is a thing the bottom land did to a good many hopeful men. He left Marin the claim, a swayback mare, a dog, and a problem. The problem was the law. Under the Homestead Act, a body had to live on the claim and work it for 5 years and then prove up swear before the land office, with witnesses, that you'd done your residence and your improvements honest, and only then did the patent come and the land was yours free and clear. Tom had filed it in his name. Tom was in the ground. And the land office down in Renderton was run by a tight, dry, by-the-letter man named Horace Quint, who had already sent Marin one notice informing her, in language a snake would have envied, that a deceased entryman's claim could be contested, that a widow's right to complete an entry was a matter of considerable legal nicety, and that absent a qualified head of household, continuing the entry in good order, the claim would revert to the public domain at the close of the proving period, which fell that year on the last day of October. It was the middle of August when she got that notice. I know all this because she came to me first, not for doctoring. She came to me because I was the one man in Quills Ferry who would tell her a straight thing without first deciding what a woman ought to hear. She sat in my front room with that notice folded small in her fist, and she laid it out plain. "Quint won't take my proof," she said. "I've done every lick of the residence and the improvement, and I've done it better than Tom ever did, and Quint won't take it because his rule book says a widow's a nicety and a married homesteader's a certainty. He as good as told me. He said if there were a man's name on the entry he'd not blink. He said it like he was doing me a kindness, telling me what I'd need." She had a low, dry, level voice, and her eyes did not water once. "Doc, I have got 9 weeks. I have buried a husband and a baby that didn't come right, and I have run that bottom alone through a winter that took softer folks than me. And I am not going to lose it on the last day of October because Horace Quint wants a man's name on a paper." "You could marry," I said, careful. "It is not a thing you say lightly to a year's widow." "I know what I could do." She looked at me. "I'm asking who. There isn't a bachelor in this valley I'd trust to keep his word past the wedding and his hands to himself after. Half of them would think a paper made me a bargain, and the other half would want the land more than they'd want to leave when I asked. I need a man who'd put his name down, mean nothing by it, ask nothing of me, and let go clean when it's proved. I need a man whose word Quint won't dare question." She paused. "Name me one." And God help me, I named him. "Eli Brunner," I said. She knew the legend, of course. Everyone did. She had not, I think, ever once thought of the legend as a man you could walk up to. That is what the legend does. I watched her turn it over. "The flood man," she said. "His word is the best in the county," I said. "Quint himself put Eli's name to the testimonial when they petitioned for the bridge. Quint thinks Eli Brunner walks on the river instead of through it. If Eli Brunner signs an entry and swears the residence, Horace Quint will stamp it and thank him for the honor." I leaned back. "And Marin, he's the one man I can promise you would mean nothing by it and let go clean. That man hasn't asked a thing of a living soul in 10 years. Asking's gone out of him. He won't trouble you." She was quiet a long moment. "He won't do it," she said finally. "Why would a man like that take on a stranger's trouble?" I almost laughed and didn't, because it would have wanted explaining and I did not have the words yet. I only said, "Go up and ask him. The worst he'll say is no, and you're no further behind than you are now." She went up the next morning. I had the whole of it from both of them, after in pieces, the way you get a story from people who don't tell stories, a line from her over the years, a line from him at the very end. So I can tell you how it went up there on the high quarter, the day the widow climbed up to the legend and knocked. He was mending a corral rail when she came up the lane, and he straightened with the hammer still in his hand and watched her come, and he did not say a word, because he did not know what a woman was doing on his lane, and he had got out of the habit of expecting good things. She was a slight woman, dark-haired, plain-dressed, with a set to her jaw. And she walked up to him across his own yard, the way nobody walked up to Eli Brunner, straight at him, eye to eye, like he was a man. "You're Brunner," she said. "I am. I'm Marin Vesper. I've got the river bottom claim that runs from the ford down to the Henning line. My husband filed it and then he died, and the land office means to take it from me on the last day of October unless a married man's name stands on the entry." She had decided plainly, to lay the whole of it down at once and let him refuse it all in one go rather than dragging him toward it. I've come to ask you to marry me. On paper. I don't want a husband and I don't expect you want a wife. I want your name on my entry and your word to Horace Quint, who will believe you over God. You keep your place, I'd keep mine. We'd be wed in name only, and the day my patent comes I'll have it annulled or you'll have your divorce, whichever's cleaner, and you'll never hear from me again. I'll pay what I can. I know it's a strange thing to ask a stranger. She stopped. She had run out of speech, and she stood there in his yard with her chin up, waiting for the no. Now you have to understand what that was, what she did, standing there. For 10 years not one person in that county had come up that lane and asked Eli Brunner for a plain thing, man to man, not his help, not his name, not the time of day, without first making him into the legend and themselves small in front of it. They came to admire him or they did not come at all. And here was this dry-voiced widow who had clearly heard the legend and just as clearly set it aside on the ground somewhere down the lane, and was standing in his yard treating him like a neighbor she meant to do business with, asking him a favor, as if he were a man who could give one. He told me, years on, the thing he remembered was that she looked tired and she did not let it show, and that she had said it would never hear from him again like it was the sweetener of the deal, and that something in him had wanted to say, "Don't promise that." He did not say it. He stood there a while. "You done your proving honest?" he asked her. "The residence, the improvement, all of it true?" "Every day of it. I'll show you the books. I'll walk you every acre. I won't ask you to swear to a lie." "I won't swear to one." "I'm not asking you to." He looked at her a while longer. And then Eli Brunner, who had not asked a living soul for anything in 10 years, and who had not been asked for anything but a story in just as long, said the thing that started it. "I'll need to see the land," he said. "I won't put my name on residence I haven't seen with my own eyes. If it's true like you say, I'll sign it." She had braced so hard for no that the yes nearly knocked her sideways. I had it from her that she stood there a beat too long and then said, too crisp, covering it, "Tomorrow, then. Come down to the bottom and I'll show you," and turned to go before her face could do anything she hadn't given it leave to do. "Mrs. Vesper." She turned back. "You don't have to pay me anything," he said. He'd looked at the ground when he said it. Wasn't ever going to take pay. And that a small thing, a refusal of money, was the first crack, though neither of them knew it yet. He came down to the bottom the next day, and she walked him every acre. And I'll tell you, those two went over that claim like a pair of horse traders. And it was the first conversation either of them had had in a year that wasn't padded out with grief or with awe. She showed him the soddy she'd lived in 2 winters, the well Tom had dug and she'd lined, the 40 acres she'd broke and the corn she'd put in and the weir she'd built across the slough with her own hands to keep the spring flood off the low corner. And Eli Brunner, the flood man, stood and looked at that weir a long time. "You built this," he said. "I built it. It's built right." He said it plain, the way a man says a fact, and from him, the man who knew water better than any soul alive, it was not nothing. She told me later that no one, not Tom, not her own father, had ever once said a thing she'd made was built right. The men in her life had all been the kind who looked at a woman's work and found the flaw to be helpful. Eli looked at her weir and saw that it was built right and said so, and went on to the next thing. They were married 11 days later in my front room by a circuit preacher who didn't know either of them and asked no questions. I stood witness. So did my wife, Bess, God rest her. It was the strangest wedding I ever stood up at. The bride and groom shook hands afterward, actually shook hands, like the close of a deal, and Marin said, "I'll have the books ready for Quint's man when he comes to inspect." And Eli said, "I'll be there for the inspection and the proving both, whatever days they fall." And that was the whole of the romance. And Bess looked at me sideways and I looked at the floor, and we neither of us said a word until they'd gone. Here is where I would have told you the story was a sad little business arrangement, and nothing more. Except for one decision, Marin Vesper made that changed the shape of the whole thing. She decided he should live down at the bottom. Not for love, for the law. Horace Quint, she pointed out, was the kind of man who'd send his inspector to find out whether the married homesteader actually resided on the claim, and a man's name on the entry with the man himself living 5 miles off up the high quarter was exactly the sort of nicety Quint would gut the entry over. If Eli's name was going on the residence, Eli's boots had better be on the residence. She'd thought it through like she thought everything through, cold and complete. He could have the soddy. She'd take the linta she'd built off the side for the dog and the harness, separate as church pews, but under one roof on the books, in the eyes of the law and Horace Quint's inspector, residing. Eli thought about it for the space of one long breath and said all right. And so the legend came down off his shelf and went to live in a soddy in the river bottom with a widow who had no use for legends, through the back half of one autumn. And that is the part of this I have been a long time getting to, because it is the part I love. It went badly at first. Of course it did. You take two people who have each spent years inside their own quiet, one walled up by grief, one walled up by glory, and you put them under one low roof, and they bark their shins on each other for a while. He was used to being deferred to, and she deferred to no one. She was used to running her own ground her own way, and here was this big silent man underfoot. And the worst of it, she told me, the absolute worst, was that he was good at everything and never said so. He'd see a thing wanted doing and do it before she could ask, and not mention it. And she'd come on a mended gate or a split rick of firewood or a doctored hoof on the swayback mare, and have no one to thank because he'd gone off to the far field, and it made her furious for reasons she couldn't name. She named them eventually. She told me, years on, laughing. I was furious, she said, because I'd come to him to be left alone and the man would not leave me a single thing to need him for. He'd taken even that asterisk off me. I'd built my whole self around not needing a soul, and he came down and quietly proved I didn't, by doing every needful thing before I'd finished resenting that it needed doing. I could have brained him with the skillet. So she did the only thing a proud, fair-minded woman could do. She started doing his needful things back. He'd mend her gait. She'd resole his boots, which she did better than the cobbler in Renderton, having a hand for leather. He'd split her wood. She'd bake, and she baked like an angel, and would leave a pie on the soddy table without a word, the way he left chores without a word, the two of them carrying on a whole conversation in deeds because neither could yet manage it in speech. He'd come in from the field to find his shirts mended with stitches finer than his mother's, and not know what to say, and say nothing, and eat the pie. It was the courting of two people who would each have denied with their dying breath that any courting was going on, conducted entirely in firewood and pastry and resoled boots. And slowly the talking came. It came up at the table over supper, which they took together for the law's sake. The inspector might come any evening unannounced, and it would not do for him to find man and wife eating apart, and then went on taking together after a while for no reason either would admit. It came slow, the way I told you Eli's words came, lifted up careful out of the deep well. But she had a dry wit on her, and she'd needle him gently, and he had a slow dry wit of his own buried under 10 years of disuse. And she dug it out a little at a time like a woman working a splinter patient, until one night she said something tart about Horace Quint, and a sound came out of Eli Brunner that he himself seemed startled by, and it was a laugh, and Marin told me she sat there at that table and thought, I don't believe that man has laughed out loud in years. I don't believe he remembered he could. She made it her business after that to make him do it again. Not out of tenderness, she'd have told you then. Out of stubbornness. She'd found a thing that the great Eli Brunner couldn't do easily, the legend with no flaw, and by God she was going to make him laugh if it killed her, the way you'll worry at the one loose thread in a thing that's otherwise too perfect to stand. I'll tell you the moment she stopped pretending it was stubbornness, because she told it to me herself, and it is the truest small thing in this whole account. It was a cold, clear evening in the back of September, and they were on the soddy step after supper, him on the low end and her on the high, watching the light go off the antler buttes, and out of nowhere he started to talk. About the flood. He had never once in 10 years told a soul his own version of that night. The town had a version, and it was bigger than his, and he'd let it stand because correcting a legend is a lonely, useless labor. But he told asterisk her asterisk, on the step in the dark in that slow, careful voice. He told her he'd been afraid the whole 2 nights, so afraid he'd been sick over the side of the saddle and hidden it. He told her the mule, Pilgrim, had done the brave part and he'd only held on. He told her about the henning girl on his back in the water, how she'd had her arms locked around his throat so tight he couldn't breathe, and he'd thought, if I tell her to ease off, she'll think I mean to drop her. So he just kept wadding half strangled, seeing black, sure they were both going under, and they hadn't. And he told her the part no one knew, the part he'd carried alone for 10 years, that when it was over and the town started in on the legend, he had felt, under the gratitude, a kind of grief, because he understood somehow even then that the story was going to come and stand between him and every person in that valley for the rest of his life. That he'd saved them all, and it had cost him every one of them. That he'd been less lonely asterisk before he was a hero. I never said that to anybody, he told her on the step. Sounds an ungrateful thing to say. A man saves folks, he oughtn't begrudge that they're grateful. And Marin Vesper, the widow who had walled herself up so no one could need her and no one could leave, looked at this walled-up man in the dark and understood that they were the same animal in 2 different traps, and she did the bravest thing in this story, braver than the flood, I have always thought. She reached over in the dark and took his hand. Just took it and held it and didn't say a single word because there was no word, and she knew there was no word, and the holding was the word. She told me she felt his whole arm go still as stone, and then, slow, like a thing thawing, his fingers closed over hers. They sat there a long time, she said, not talking, and when she finally got up to go into her lean-to, neither of them made anything of it, said anything about it, because to say a thing about it would have been to admit the paper had become something else, and neither of them was ready to be that brave twice in one night. But she knew, and he knew, and after that the firewood and the pie and the Risoled boots weren't a fair trade between strangers anymore. They were love letters, just written in the only alphabet either of those 2 stubborn, lonesome people had ever learned. Now the law does not care about any of that, and the calendar least of all, and the back of October was coming on, and that is when the river tried to take it all a second time. It was an early storm and a bad one, the kind that comes down off the antlers 2 weeks before its season and catches a valley with its harvest half in. It came in the night with a wind that woke me 5 miles off in town, and it dropped rain like the sky had broke open, and within the hour I knew, lying there listening to it, that the Maddox was going to come up. Not a 78, God was merciful, but enough. Enough to take a low-corner cornfield and a season's labor, and if it crested wrong, enough to wash out a weir and undercut a soddy and leave a land office inspector, a flooded ruin to look at 3 days before the proving, which Horace Quint would surely rule was not a residence in good order. Down in the bottom, Marin was up and out in it before the worst hit, in her husband's old slicker, going for the weir she'd built, the one Eli had said was built right, because if the slough came over it the low 40 was gone and maybe the soddy too. And Eli came out after her, and there in the rain and the dark and the rising water, the flood man and the woman who'd built the weir stood in the slough together and fought the river for her land. I had it from both of them and it agreed in every part, which is how you know a thing is true. He did not take over, that is the part she could never get done telling. The flood man, the legend, the man who'd held the Maddox single-handed, he came up beside her in that slough and he did not shove her aside and play the hero. He asked asterisk her, "It's your weir," he hollered over the wind. "You built it, you know it, tell me where it'll go first." And she told him the north shoulder, where the slough turned and they shored the north shoulder, the 2 of them, hauling and packing sod and rock in the black wet with the water climbing their legs, working off her knowledge and his strength like one creature with two heads. And when the slough came up, it came up against a shoulder built to take it, and it held. It held because she'd built it right, and he'd believed her. They came in near dawn soaked to the bone and shaking and laughing, the both of them, that wrung out laughing you do when you've stood in the dark next to your own ruin. And somehow it didn't come. And she got the fire up and he got out of the soaked slicker, and they sat by the fire too tired to be careful any more. And she looked at this big drowned man laughing in her firelight, and she said the thing. "I don't want to annul it," she said. He stopped laughing. "I want you to understand me," she said, because she was a woman who needed a thing said square. "The land'll be safe in 3 days. Quint'll stamp the patent and you'll have done your part and you can ride back up to your high quarter free as air. No debt, no claim, nothing owed, and that was the deal and I'll hold to it if it's what you want. I'm not asking out of need. The land's proved either way now. I could take it free and clear and go to my sister in Oregon tomorrow and never want for a thing." She made herself look at him. "I'm telling you I don't want to. I'm telling you I'd rather stay in this soddy with you, where there's no need to it at all, than have the whole of Oregon. That's the worst kind of fool to be, the kind that doesn't have to. I'd as soon you knew it." And Eli Brunner sat there dripping by her fire, the man who had not asked a living soul for a single thing in 10 years. And I will give you what he said exactly as he gave it to me, near the end of his life, with his eyes wet, because he never could tell it without his eyes going wet. "I'd had it figured," he said, "that I'd save up the gratitude, the whole town's worth of it. Figured if I just kept it banked it'd be enough to live on. Cold comfort, but comfort." He looked at his hands. "And then you come up my lane and asked me a favor like I was just a man with a name worth something, and I went down to your bottom, and you showed me a thing you'd built, and I told you it was built right. And you looked at me like nobody'd said it to you either. And I thought, by God, here's 2 of us. And I've been 10 years cold, Marin, and 3 weeks warm, and a man can't go back to the cold once he's recollected the warm. He can't. I'd not survive it." He looked up at her. "I don't want the divorce," he said. "I never wanted it. I'll tell Quint and the preacher and the whole county it's real and let them make of it what they want. You're the first person in 10 years climbed up that lane and treated me like a man and not a story, and I'd be the worst fool God ever made to let you ride to Oregon over a paper I'd be glad to burn." Then he said, slow, careful, lifting it up out of the deepest part of that deep well, "Stay. I'm asking you to stay. That's me asking. First thing I've asked anybody in 10 years, and I'm asking you." And the widow who'd walled herself up so no one could ever leave her crossed that soddy floor and put her arms around the legend. And the legend held on like a man who'd been cold a long, long time, and the rest of that is theirs and not mine to tell, except to say the fire was warm and the door was shut and the river had gone down, and whatever passed between them passed as it should between 2 grown people who had chosen each other free and clear, with no paper making them and no need driving them. Only the plain glad fact that each of them, at long last, had been seen asterisk. Marin proved up 3 days later. Horace Quint's inspector found the residence in good order and the married homesteader resident upon it, and Quint stamped the patent and shook Eli Brunner's hand and was honored, just as I'd told her he'd be, the dry old fool, and never knew he'd very nearly cost the county the only good thing that came of that whole sorry land act. Marin Vesper Brunner held the title to her river bottom free and clear, hers, proved up honest by her own 2 hands the way she'd always said. And she did not go to Oregon. She tore up the half-written letter to her sister and wrote a different one, and I do not know what it said, but I know her sister came out the next spring to visit and stayed a month and cried at the wedding that wasn't, the second one, the real one, that Marin and Eli held in the bottom under the cottonwoods with the whole valley there, where they said the words over again and meant them this time in front of everybody, the legend and the widow, plain as 2 people can be. The town never did quite figure it out. They were so used to loving Eli at arm's length that they couldn't account for how this dry little widow had walked straight up and loved him close, and a few of the mothers who'd steered their daughters wide were put out about it, I think, though they'd never have said. But the children understood it fine. The children always do. The Henning girl, the one off his back in the flood, was grown by then and married herself, and she came to the Cottonwood wedding and told Marin, "He carried me across the whole river and never once made me feel like I weighed anything." And Marin said, "Yes, he does that." And the two of them understood each other entirely. Eli came down off his shelf and stayed down. He took to coming to town again. Now there was a reason, and folks got used to him being a man instead of a story, and it did him a power of good. He laughed more in the next 30 years than in the 10 before. Marin saw to that. They never had children of their own. That grief was an old one, and they let it be. But they fostered 2 of the Tarrant orphans when the fever went through in '84, and raised them up fine. And those 2 are grown now with children of their own who know Eli Brunner only as a kind old grandfather who was good with a hurt animal and slow to speak and quick to laugh once you knew him, and not as any kind of legend at all, which is exactly how he'd have wanted it. He died last winter, 80 years old, in the soddy that he and Marin had long since built out into a real fine house, with her hand in his. I was there. I'd doctored him his whole life, and it fell to me to be there at the end of it. And I'll tell you the last clear thing he said, because it's the thing I started out to say to you, and I've taken the long way round to it. Marin was holding his hand and crying, quiet, the way she did everything. And Eli looked at her and got that slow, careful look like he was lifting one last thing up out of the well, and he said, "You walked up my lane and asked me a favor." "I did," she said. "Best thing," he said, "anybody ever done for me." And then, because he was Eli and dry to the last, "And I never even charged you." She laughed and she cried at the same time, and he was gone before the laugh was done, with the joke still warm in the room, which is as good a way as I know for a good man to go. So that is the truth of Eli Brunner, that I'm the last one alive to tell. The county will tell you about the flood. They'll tell you about the night he held the river, and they'll have it 10 feet tall, the water higher and the dark blacker, the legend they made and loved him for and nearly froze him to death with. But I knew the man, and I'll tell you the bigger thing he ever did, the braver thing by a mile. A tired widow walked up his lane one August morning with a paper marriage and a cold bargain, meaning nothing by it, meaning to take what she needed and ride to Oregon and leave him exactly as alone as she'd found him. And the loneliest man in the county, the man on the high shelf, the man behind the glass, the man no one had climbed up to in 10 long years, looked at that bargain, and looked at that woman who'd treated him like a man and not a monument. And instead of banking the favor like cold comfort against the rest of a cold life, he did the hardest thing a walled-up man can do. He let her in. It's only a marriage on paper, she'd promised him, that first day in his yard, so he'd not be afraid of it. They were both of them wrong, thank God, and they had the next 30 years to be glad of it.